Welcome back to Ion Foxborough. I'm Chris Mason here with Mark Daniels. Mark has gotten an early jump on his summer reading. Mark, you want to tell the good people what you've been up to and how much fun it was trying to track this book down?
Ron Wolf, who is the father of Eliot Wolf, wrote this book called The Packer Way. And essentially, he details 9 stepping stones that he used to take over the Green Bay Packers. And after, Eliot got hired or promoted or sort of promoted, this offseason, I heard about the book and I was like, all right, I'm going to buy this book and I'm going to read it and see if there are any parallels between what Ron did and what Eliot does this offseason. And Chris, at first, let me tell you, it was not easy to get my hands on this book. I think every beat writer on the Patriots must have been bidding for it because it was nuts what happened. First, I ordered it off eBay, and that book just never arrived. So eBay gave me my $7 refund, and then I bought it off another used like bookstore site in New York, and then all of a sudden they didn't have it, so they refunded me my money. And then the $7 to $10 book I was searching for suddenly shot up between 60 and $300 on the internet. So I don't know if the people who owned the Ron Wolf book sort of knew that people were suddenly searching for it, but I was like, I'm not spending $300 on a book. So I bided my time. My wife kept searching and she found one on Amazon. And this was under 30. So when I got it around 20 bucks, I just, I hit purchase and I took basically the off season reading this book, and it was fascinating, and I thought it was an interesting look into Ron Wolf's philosophy. And the first parallel here is that Ron Wolf took over a Green Bay Packers team that won 4 games, and they're actually really bad. And here's one stat I really didn't know: from 1968 to 1991, the Packers had only 4 winning seasons, which is actually really nuts. So Ron Wolf then becomes the GM for 9 total seasons. The Packers go 92 and 52, and they beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl in 1996. And when Ron was essentially finishing up, he writes his book just detailing everything. So like I'm a history buff when it comes to the NFL and football, so I like that stuff. So it was really really interesting. And what we're gonna do here, I'm gonna go over each stepping stone. I'm gonna read an excerpt of the book. And me and Chris are going to talk about how it could or has related to Eliot Wolf. So Chris, without further ado, stepping stone number 1 is pretty straightforward. Identified what needs to be fixed. And this is what Ron writes. Every rebuilding situation is faced with a list of problems as lengthy as the ones I was contemplating. You can react one of two ways. You can stare at all the needs and wonder how you'll ever get them fixed, or more intelligently, you can accept the fact that everything won't be solved overnight. So, what Ron Wolf did was, hey, this roster really stinks. I want to focus on draft and development. He called it a stepping stone approach, and he basically wanted to improve his roster everywhere until he can make bigger moves in the draft. So his first goal was basically adding competition. Chris, seems pretty straightforward. What do you think about stepping stone number 1?
I think it is really straightforward, and I think you saw Elliott start to attack that in the draft, right? Where identify what needs to be fixed. What needs to be fixed on this team? It's the offense. And if you look at all the needs in the draft, they were addressed early on, whether that's quarterback, wide receiver, tackle, which we think might work. But just go down like 7 of 8 picks are on offense. Offense needs to be fixed. One thing that jumped out to me from this excerpt too is that you can accept the fact that everything won't be solved overnight. I think that's also the approach that Elliott is taking to this, realizing the Patriots, there's no magic wand to fix this 4-13 roster. It's going to take time. They're probably going to be competitive maybe by the end of 2025. 2024 it's a rebuild year, and I think he's going to attack it as such.
And he basically wanted to add competition. So Ron Wolf added like level veterans to just shore up his roster. And you look at what the Patriots did in free agency. It's like Jacoby Brissett, KJ Osborne, Chuck Okorafor, Antonio Gibson. That's actually exactly what Eliot Wolf did. He added more competition. There weren't like big signings, but they shored up the roster. And so it brings us to stepping stone number 2. A bit tough for Elliott to follow in the footsteps for this one, but we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Stepping stone number 2: hire the best before anyone else does. Quote from Ron Wolf: I was confident we could fill the Packers roster with wonderful players and we could have a terrific staff of assistant coaches, but I was convinced unless we truly found stars to become our quarterback and coach, the Packers would never threaten for a championship. So Ron Wolf, like most GMs, when he takes over, he got to hire a head coach. What he did was traded a second round pick to San Francisco for the rights to Mike Holmgren, who was the OC, and they had this clause in Holmgren's contract that wouldn't allow him to leave without compensation. And then after that, Chris, he had his eyes set on Brett Favre, which was one of my favorite stories in the book. Ron Wolf worked for the Jets as a like a director of player personnel. And in the draft, they desperately wanted Brett Favre, but the Falcons drafted him one spot ahead of him in the second round. The Falcons, however, the head coach didn't want Brett Favre, and he had him as the third string quarterback for his rookie year. And the reports out of Atlanta at the time was that he was partying and out of shape. So the people in Atlanta knew Ron Wolf loved Brett Favre. So when he took over the Packers, they're like, hey, you want Brett Favre? All it'll cost you is a first round pick. So he trades a first round pick for a guy who the previous year was drafted in the second round. At the time, he was kind of crushed for the move, but he quickly identified his coach and his quarterback. Now, the coach does not apply at all to Eliot Wolf, but the quarterback thing I found interesting because Ron's first thing was, hey, I need a quarterback to be a star. And I think we sort of saw Eliot approach the draft in a similar sense.
Yeah, and I'm confident that Elliott thinks that Drake is going to be a star because otherwise I don't think he would have taken him at 3. I think he would have continued biding his time, maybe until next year, maybe until it's, attacking someone in free agency, going a different route. But he spent the number 3 overall pick on a quarterback. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about how the front office feels about the potential there. And like you said, the coach is a different situation here where he inherited Gerard, but I think Robert probably feels like he's following this stepping stone, hire the best before anyone else because he keeps trying to promote from within, thinks he has the right guys in his front office already doing that sort of thing. So maybe that's a Robert stepping stone more than an Elliott one right now. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think he's definitely confident in the quarterback here.
We get to stepping stone number 3, and it's quote, develop an obsession with winning today. Now, this is what Ron writes. I visualized the stepping stone approach to build a winning roster this way. We need to establish a solid foundation of veteran players by keeping our best athletes from the 1991 team who are willing to accept Mike Holmgren's coaching ways. So essentially, Ron wanted to keep around core veteran players who fit in with Mike Holmgren's new coaching style. He basically wrote he thought if they could upgrade the roster even a little with the improved coaching staff, he thought they would show minor incremental improvements. I also think this is sort of what Elliott did this year, right, Chris? Because he brought back a whole slew of Patriots.
Yeah, it's funny too. Like if you read like the headline itself and it's just develop an obsession with winning today, that stepping stone. It's like maybe we don't need that in Foxborough right now. I don't think anyone would accuse the Patriots of not being obsessed with winning over the last 20 plus years. But when you get
Yeah.
into the nitty gritty, yeah. I mean, it does seem like he's brought a bunch of these core tenants back and is trying to build that way towards like a winning culture. But it is that's the one that jumped out to me is like develop an obsession with winning. It's like, all right, I think that one already exists here.
Yeah, for sure. And basically, Ron, he filled the roster with veteran players with the hopes they would compete with his draft picks. And that's actually exactly what Eliot Wolf did. So, for example, with Drake May, there's Jacoby Brissett. With Jalen Polk and Javon Baker, there's KJ Osborne and Kendrick Bourne. And with rookie tackle Caden Wallace, he signed Chuck Okorafor to a 1-year deal. So, actually, all the guys he drafted, they all have veterans there that will allow them to sit and develop if need be. And now, stepping stone number 4, play to your strengths. Quote, first, you must acknowledge the negatives. Then you must either eliminate them, or if that isn't possible, identify positives and begin emphasizing them so strongly that they overwhelm the negatives. That's how you play to your strengths, the essence of the 4th stepping stone. Now, this was interesting. When Ron Wolf got to Green Bay, the knock was that veteran players didn't want to go there for 2 reasons. It was really cold in the winter, and there was no nightlife. So Ron Wolf's plan was, hey, I need to bring in tough-minded individuals who like playing in the cold, and we need to turn Lambeau Field or Lambeau Stadium into a place that has a home field advantage. In terms of the nightlife thing, he also tried to play up the community aspect of playing for the Packers. I mean, it's honestly, it's similar to the Patriots, right? Because it obviously gets cold here in New England.
What is Wisconsin's millionaire tax like? Because
Yeah.
that's the latest Massachusetts one you're hearing. But yeah, the whole thing's interesting in playing to your strengths too, where like with this roster, that's definitely going to be the defense, right? Like moving forward, do you see a way that they can play to those strengths heading into the season?
Yeah, basically they have a defensive heavy roster and they have to hope their defense is a top 10 unit and their offense is, improved from last year. If you can be better than tied for 31st in scoring, move that up into like the 20s or like an average to slightly below average team, you should win more games. In terms of like finding players who excel in the cold, I thought that was interesting because Eliot Wolf kind of did that. Like for example, a lot of the guys he signed are actually from East Coast teams, like Jacoby Brissett, Washington, Antonio Gibson, Washington, KJ Osborne, Minnesota, Okorafor, Pittsburgh, and Taki played in Cleveland. So I mean, some parallels there. But so I'll be honest. In the book, I had trouble with one chapter. It was really kind of long. And it was stepping stone number 5. It is use the 4 C's to measure performance. The quote, the cornerstones of the 5th stepping stone are 4 principles. Expect certain devotion, expect certain dedication, expect certain work ethic, expect certain results. Essentially, Ron Wolf noticed that people in Green Bay were leaving as soon as the clock hit 5 and they were kind of checking out. He didn't love the he thought there were just internal issues and didn't love the work ethic and drive. He thought people were basically checking out too early. He wanted to change the entire culture. Now, to his credit, he was also really, really tough on his new employees, but he doled out praise. Now, there's a couple parallels here, Chris, with the Patriots. First, the Patriots had a different issue. It wasn't that guys weren't working hard. It's that under Bill Belichick, things were sort of rigid in a sense. It wasn't the kindest atmosphere. So what Gerard Mayo and Eliot Wolf have done, they've changed out a ton of signs. People don't see things like "do your job" anymore. Instead, it's like "we, not me." And in terms of Ron Wolf doling out praise to other people while being tough on them, Eliot Wolf also did the same exact thing. He's taking credit for nothing. It's more of a group collaborative thing.
So my first major issue with the 4 C's is that they're not actually C's. Like he just shoehorned the word certain into all of these. Expect certain devotion, expect certain dedication, expect certain work ethic, expect certain results. That's really a D, a D, a W, E, and an R. That's not 4 C's. You just threw the word certain in there in front of all of them to make them the 4 C's, which is
Yeah,
catchy.
I
But
think they struggled with the chapter name on that one.
yeah.
That's my takeaway.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you also struggled with this chapter too and getting through it. Maybe you wanted to punch out at 5, but this is, where you really had to rise above, grind a little bit, and get the win here. Um, but yeah, I do agree with you on the aspect of Elliot really just praising everyone else and like deflecting any sort of credit at this point. I think that's probably something that he definitely got from his dad. I don't think that's a 4 C's thing. I think that's just probably growing up in that organization and just watching how they did things. So I think that carries over, but the 4 C's, I'm not buying them.
No, they're not really 4 C's. I'll be honest, it took me 3 weeks to finish that chapter. It was very long. And like we were in the middle of the draft and I was working on the Drake May feature and I sort of paused it. I had to continue it. So I basically got through it and I got to stepping stone number 6, which is making it work. Quote, I wanted to rely most heavily on the draft because I felt long-term stability of a roster depended on the number of young quality players we obtained. And the draft was the best method to acquire these youngsters. So when it came to rebuilding, Ron Wolf didn't just rely on his scouts. He sort of changed things a little bit. He had to keep Mike Holmgren in the loop. And basically, what Holmgren and his staff did, they also broke down tape of free agents and guys in this scouting process, and they told Ron who they liked. So Ron had the guys the coaches liked, and then he brought together his scouts who they liked and he put together a draft board. I guess at the time it wasn't always done that way. Usually it was just the GM and the scouts and the coaches had absolutely no say. Ron didn't want it to be like that. And I think this is a great example of what Elliott and Gerard have done and changed this year in New England.
Yeah, and I mean, Elliott even changed the entire scouting system, so
Yeah.
it's completely different than what Bill was doing for a long time. It's supposedly more like easily accessible now for everybody in the room. We'll see if that pays off. But I mean, I do think that Elliott and Gerard have really hammered the importance of the draft over and over and over. And that's something that Robert has done too, where I think everybody wants to hit on the draft. And I think they're really, putting a lot of resources into trying to do that. And yeah, I mean, I think this stepping stone does check out.
Yeah, and this year, it was really similar because Gerard Mayo had his assistant coaches break down college tape and free agent tape, and the coaches actually reported to the coordinators. The coordinators reported to Mayo, and Mayo reported to Eliot Wolf. And then we saw in the draft, he had all the assistant coaches there. Like the OCs were there, a lot of the assistant coaches were there. So when they were debating the players and who to draft, coaches along with scouts and guys in the front office all had to say, that has not been what it's like That was not what it was like with Bill Belichick at all, Chris. Like very different.
No, and philosophically, it does make a ton of sense to do it this way, right? If you're talking to the
Yeah.
guys that are going to be coaching these guys and you're looking for certain fits, why wouldn't you consult them? I mean, at the end of the day, you could still not listen. You could be like, oh, okay, I'm going a different route with that anyways. But to at least have that dialogue, I think makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. So we get to stepping stone number 7. This is called keeping it going. Quote, you can't allow short-term obstacles and shortcut solutions to obscure your vision. You must develop an ability to measure progress even when those outside those organizations see none. So after, he hires Mike Holmgren and trades for Brett Favre, Ron Wolf made a ton of roster moves, but they were considered minor moves. And basically people in the media didn't think that he was doing enough. But basically, Holmgren was on the same page that he knew it was going to be a slower rebuild, which allowed Ron Wolf to sort of stick by his draft and develop strategy. But one thing he really wanted to do was, quote, retain strong core leaders. And he called these guys the spokes on his wheel. He needed good veterans in the building to help develop these players. And Chris, I think this goes back to what Eliot did in free agency and his strategy.
Are you referring to like Hunter Henry or Kendrick Bourne or Mike Onwenu or Anthony Jennings or Josh Uche or
Yeah,
the list
Kyle
goes
Duggar,
on
like,
and on. Yeah, Kyle Duggar, of course. The list goes on and on and on. And yeah, it's clearly exactly what he's doing, right? He's trying to bring back these core pieces, foster a culture, and move things forward. Yeah, I think that's a slam dunk right there.
yeah, and it doesn't work if like you're a GM and you're like, all right, I'm gonna do a slow rebuild. It doesn't work if your head coach isn't on the same page. And I think obviously Gerard understands what's going on, and we've even heard from Gerard, hey, like, this is going to be slower. We're going to take our time. We're going to develop people, and hopefully they can have some success. So stepping stone number 8 is called handling the unexpected. Quote, we became so dazzled by the reputation of people from other organizations, we fail to recognize the talents of our own personnel. If you've trained your own people properly, you should have able replacements already on the payroll. So when the Packers started to have success, Wolf didn't completely alter his strategy. Like all of a sudden, free agents wanted to go to Green Bay, but he relied on the guys he was drafting and developing to replace certain free agents. So like, you know, even though they were Super Bowl contenders, he was still really honing in on drafting and developing. And I thought what he says like handling the unexpected. Really, he was talking about injuries. So, like in 1995, they have an all-pro receiver, Sterling Sharp. He had to abruptly retire, like after 94. He had a great 94 season, but he had this serious neck injury. He just couldn't play. It was like he was at basically risk of being paralyzed. And Wolf, like they were nervous. They were thought about spending money in free agency, but in the end of the day, the guy who replaced him was someone named Robert Brooks, who was a third round pick, which goes back to Wolf's draft and develop strategy. So like this guy abruptly retires, Pro Bowl receiver, but they have a third round pick on the roster. So it's like Robert Brooks goes out the next season, Chris. He catches 102 passes for almost 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns. And Ron Wolf is like, see, we're draft and develop even when we have success. Now, we have no idea if Eliot will be able to do the same thing, but I still think this goes back to having veterans on the roster who allow their rookie players to develop. Because what he said about Ron Brooks, I think applies to like Jalen Polk, Drake May, Javon Baker. It was, quote, the fact he didn't have to start as a rookie and could spend time learning from veterans and refining his skills enabled him to gain knowledge of the scheme that we needed to excel. So basically, he said, hey, we allowed Robert Brooks to develop behind a Pro Bowl receiver, and when we needed him, bam, he was there.
Right. And if you train your own people properly, you should have able replacements already on the payroll. Jumped out to me because I think that's kind of a microcosm of what made the Belichick era so successful for such a long time. And then ultimately what led to the end of it is they
Yeah.
were so good at next man up, whether that's on the field or in the front office. He going from Casario to Dave Ziegler, and ultimately, things broke down on the field. Like Mac Jones couldn't play. You go to Bailey Zappi, he couldn't really play either. That's breaking down. Like the draft started to crumble. But for such a long time in that dynasty, there were guys that would come out of nowhere and they would turn out to be unbelievable players. And it's like, who was that? Like you have Julian Edelman, behind Wes Welker. He suddenly comes up, becomes like one of the most clutch players in NFL history. So yeah, I think this is a stepping stone that really like creates a sustainable franchise. It's if you have that next guy, if you can keep moving forward. And that's something that I think the Patriots lost over the last few years, and it really killed the roster accordingly.
I saw this when I first joined the beat because 2014, The Patriots cornerbacks were Darrelle Revis and Brandon Browner. And Chris, it's like the most fun secondary I've ever covered. Those guys were awesome personalities. Browner was out there for a variety of reasons, but Revis was phenomenal. But the next offseason, they lost both of them in free agency and didn't really sign anyone. And everyone's like me. I'm like, oh my God, they don't have it. They don't have the guys. Like how like their cornerbacks are gonna stink. But actually what they had was Logan Ryan, a third round pick, and Malcolm Butler, an undrafted free agent. And both of those guys developed. And they replaced Darrelle Revis with Malcolm Butler and Brandon Browner with Logan Ryan. And actually it worked. And they won Super Bowls with those guys. So you're right. Bill Belichick used to do that a ton. And they kind of lost their way with their draft strategy. And now we get into the nine stepping stone, which doesn't apply to Eliot Wolf yet, but we're going to talk about it. It's called staying on top. Quote, to make up for substantial losses, I had to utilize the same tools that helped us become good in the first place. Promote young players already on the roster to starting spots, draft potential starters, and rely on free agency to fill remaining holes. So basically, as Ron Wolf found out, when the Packers won a Super Bowl and they were good, when their players hit free agency, they were getting outbid from. That's exactly what happened with the Patriots over, the course of their dynasty. We would see guys constantly, hit free agency and cash out after the Pats won. But Ron Wolf stuck to his homegrown talent method, and he was able to replace those guys to create a winning franchise. And one interesting parallel here with Eliot Wolf is what happened with Sterling Sharp. So after they lose him to that neck injury, they actually tried to sign Andre Rison in free agency, but they weren't willing to go to a stupid amount of money. And they're like, we're not going to bid for this guy. Instead, they focused on Robert Brooks, and it worked out for him. But that parallels to Eliot Wolf, Chris, because the same thing happened this offseason. They needed a receiver. They bid like $20 million for Calvin Ridley, but they wouldn't go above what Tennessee was offering them. So by not signing Calvin Ridley, Eliot Wolf turns around and drafts Javon Baker and Jalen Polk. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. I mean, obviously staying on top is not relevant because the Patriots are nowhere near the top.
Yeah, no, and I thought that was a really good example that you highlighted in this section because honestly, they're going to have to get to the top first before this even applies at all. But that is a very similar approach to free agency and to not overspending and resisting the temptation to win the offseason when really you're trying to win during the season. You're not trying to win the offseason.
No. And this offseason, I think we were at the combine and someone asked Eliot Wolf what the Packer way was. And his quote was, quote, the Packer way to me is just sort of draft and develop, extend your core players from within. And I was like, oh yeah, he said that. And then I read the book and I'm like, this is exactly what his father did. So I think this book, The Packer Way, was a really good example of, what Ron Wolf did, but what Eliot Wolf is going to continue to do with the Patriots.
Yeah, and I think you definitely saw him take the first steps to doing that this offseason with re-signing the guys, with making the picks that he made. I think it's clear that he wants to draft and develop and build from within. So that's our pod. The book is The Packer Way. If you want to find it, good luck. Best of luck to you. I think you're going to probably struggle with that. But thanks for listening, and we'll catch you further on down the trail.